90. The closing years of the 17th century marked a period of profound transformation for the Ottoman Empire, a state that had once commanded vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. By the 1690s, decades of military campaigns, internal reforms, and ambitious expansion had brought the empire to a pivotal crossroads. The consequences of the failed siege of Vienna in 1683 and the subsequent Great Turkish War, 1683-1697, reverberated throughout Ottoman political, military, and diplomatic spheres, shaping the empire's trajectory well into the 18th century. Militarily, the Ottomans faced stark evidence of their declining battlefield supremacy. While earlier reforms under the Koprulu viziers had temporarily revitalized the army, the empire now struggled to compete with a Europe that had embraced modernization and innovation. Ottoman forces still relied heavily on traditional cavalry units, which had once dominated the plains of Central Europe and Anatolia. Siege warfare, a long-standing Ottoman specialty, now lagged behind European techniques, as artillery technology, standardized drills, and integrated infantry formations gave European armies a decisive edge. These tactical gaps were painfully evident during prolonged engagements in Hungary, Transylvania, and along the Danube. The professionalization and discipline of European forces, coupled with better logistics and supply management, exposed weaknesses in Ottoman strategy, leaving troops vulnerable in both pitched battles and sieges. The military setbacks translated directly into political consequences. Successive sultans during this period, including Suleiman II and Ahmed II, lacked the personal authority and strategic vision of their forebears. While the sultans remained figureheads of imperial legitimacy, the real levers of power increasingly rested in the hands of grand viziers and palace administrators. The central bureaucracy struggled to respond effectively to military emergencies, economic pressures, and social unrest. Inflation surged as the empire sought to fund ongoing conflicts, currency debasement became commonplace, and the financial burdens imposed on provincial populations fueled discontent. The Janissaries, once the backbone of Ottoman military might, had become a politically assertive and increasingly resistant force, complicating attempts at reform and further undermining the stability of the central administration. Diplomatically, the empire suffered its most tangible losses during this period. The Treaty of Carlowitz, signed in 1699, represented the first major territorial concessions by the Ottomans in Europe. For the first time in its history, the empire was forced to cede large swathes of European land to rival powers. The Habsburgs retained control over Hungary and Transylvania, consolidating their position in Central Europe and creating a buffer against future Ottoman incursions. Poland recovered Podolia, a region of strategic importance along the southeastern frontier. Venice secured significant gains along the Dalmatian coast and in the Peloponnese, reinforcing its maritime presence in the eastern Mediterranean. These territorial adjustments were not merely administrative, they signaled a fundamental shift in the balance of power, heralding an era in which the Ottomans would increasingly defend existing holdings rather than expand into new lands. The Treaty of Carlowitz also carried immense symbolic weight. The Ottoman Empire, long perceived as the unstoppable Eastern power advancing into Christian Europe, now faced the reality of strategic retreat. This transition from a conquering state to a power-managing decline forced Ottoman leaders to grapple with questions of identity, legitimacy, and policy adaptation. How could an empire that had once dictated terms on three continents redefine itself in a world where European states increasingly coordinated their military and diplomatic efforts? The treaty crystallized the limits of Ottoman revival achieved under the Koprulu viziers and underscored the need for broader institutional reform. Domestically, the post-Carlowitz years highlighted the challenges of managing both internal and external pressures simultaneously. Economic strain remained severe as the cost of sustained warfare, coupled with declining revenues from ceded territories, put immense pressure on the treasury. Inflation eroded purchasing power, and urban populations, particularly in major centers like Istanbul, faced rising prices for food and essentials. Social unrest, including sporadic revolts in provinces and growing dissatisfaction among military elites, reflected the broader sense of uncertainty. In response, Grand viziers and palace officials attempted to centralize authority, reform tax collection, and maintain discipline among the janissaries. But these measures were limited by structural weaknesses within the empire and the scale of the challenges at hand. The Ottoman military, while still formidable in many respects, also began to confront the consequences of technological and organizational stagnation. European armies had embraced gunpowder based artillery, coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics, and professionalized training regimens that gave them a strategic advantage over Ottoman forces. In contrast, Ottoman reliance on older models of warfare, combined with internal political friction, reduced the effectiveness of campaigns and limited operational flexibility. The failures of the late 17th century demonstrated that temporary revival under a strong vizier could not substitute for systemic modernization and continuous adaptation. Diplomatic engagement became increasingly reactive as the empire sought to secure its borders and negotiate from a position of relative weakness. The Treaty of Carlowitz set a precedent for future agreements in which Ottoman leadership recognized the growing influence of European coalitions. This new geopolitical reality required a reorientation of foreign policy, emphasizing defensive strategies, alliances, and selective engagement rather than aggressive expansion. Although Ottoman statesmen debated reforms and adaptation in the early 18th century, the psychological impact of territorial losses and the symbolic retreat from European ambition lingered across generations of leadership. The period also prompted reflection on administrative and institutional practices. With the Sultan's direct authority diminished, the central government relied on capable grand viziers to maintain order and coordinate policy. While strong viziers such as those from the Koprulu family had temporarily restored stability, the absence of a consistent, capable leadership structure meant that reforms were vulnerable to reversal. The empire's experience in these years underscored the delicate balance between centralized authority, military efficacy, and fiscal stability, an equilibrium that would continue to challenge Ottoman rulers throughout the 18th century. The economic consequences of this era further compounded the empire's strategic challenges. Loss of territory reduced revenue streams from taxation and trade, while inflation and currency debasement undermined public confidence. Local elites, provincial governors, and tax farmers often acted with considerable autonomy, sometimes exacerbating unrest. The Janissary Corps, whose political influence had grown during periods of weak sultanic authority, became a double-edged sword, essential for defense, but increasingly difficult to control. Maintaining military readiness and loyalty under these conditions required continuous negotiation, discipline, and resources that the empire could scarcely provide. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered a phase defined by containment rather than conquest. The loss of Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, and parts of the Dalmatian coast marked the end of an era in which Ottoman forces could project power freely into Europe. In its place, a new model of governance and military organization was required, one that balanced central authority with regional management and adopted more modern military practices. Intellectual, military, and administrative debates in Istanbul reflected an emerging awareness that survival depended on adaptation rather than mere tradition. In conclusion, the years 1697 to 1700 were pivotal in redefining the Ottoman Empire's position in Europe and the broader world. Military shortcomings, economic pressures, and administrative challenges highlighted the limitations of prior reforms. The Treaty of Carlowitz not only codified significant territorial losses, but also symbolized a transition from an expansionist empire to a state compelled to manage decline. The period forced Ottoman leaders to confront the realities of shifting European power, prompting debates on military modernization, fiscal reform, and institutional strengthening that would influence policy well into the 18th century. While the empire retained formidable resources and strategic depth, the late 17th century made clear that ambition alone was insufficient to maintain dominance. Internal cohesion, effective leadership, and adaptability to evolving military and diplomatic realities would define the Ottoman state's capacity to endure in the decades that followed. The Treaty of Carlowitz thus stands as both a landmark in Ottoman diplomacy and a cautionary moment, signaling the end of unchallenged expansion in Europe and the beginning of a new era in which survival required innovation, prudence, and strategic foresight.